Chapter 13, Disorders of Red Blood Cells. So this week we're going to talk about red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, and some of the diseases that happen because of either too many or too little of each factor. So this is a review of physiology. Erythropoiesis is the creation of new red blood cells. Red blood cells have hemoglobin, and the hemoglobin is what carries oxygen in the body. So when oxygenation of the tissues is low in the body, the kidneys secrete erythropoietin to stimulate the bone marrow to create new red blood cells. These red blood cells can be in many forms in the body, and part of when we do a complete blood count, we look at the different stages of red blood cells in the body. So there are immature red blood cells. There are reticulocytes, which are red blood cells that still have their endoplasmic reticulum, which means they're not fully developed yet. And then there are regular mature red blood cells. So when we do diagnostic testing using a complete blood cell count, we are looking at what level of maturity do the red blood cells have in the body, because that tells us the oxygen carrying capability that the body may have or may not have. Red blood cells are fragile cells, and their membranes become weakened, and eventually they end up breaking and becoming damaged and breaking in the body. They live and circulate for about 120 days if they are totally healthy. So know that it takes about 120 days to replenish red blood cells in the body should you be deficient. The spleen is the place where most red blood cells go to die, and that's where they're supposed to be processed. The white blood cells in the spleen, liver, bone marrow, and lymph nodes eat up those red blood cells, and hemoglobin is processed into bilirubin. So a large amount of unconjugated bilirubin in the body is a bad thing and creates a process that we know, a pathological process as we know as jaundice. And here we go. If it's conjugated or concentrated or done the way the body wants it to, it is known as bile. So we have two different fates of bilirubin, one being normal, bile, the second being abnormal, equals jaundice. When capillaries, when red blood cells are broken outside of the spleen, the hemoglobin gets released into the blood and creates something that we call hemoglobinuria, where your urine becomes like a brown Coca-Cola colored urine because there are red blood cells that are being excreted in that manner. Like every other thing that we're studying, we are going to have to learn the normal red blood cell lab values, and note that there is a difference in normal between men and women for this blood count only. So men tend to carry more hemoglobin, tend to have more red blood cells. Women have less red blood cells. They're essentially the same, the number range, but just know that men's lab values are higher. Reticulocytes, as we said before, make up a very, or should make up a very, in the normal setting, make up a very small percentage of the total red blood cells. If I have a high level of reticulocytes, so say I had 10% of my red blood cells being made up of reticulocytes, that would tell me that I have a large amount of very immature red blood cells in my body, and my body's trying to make up or trying to rapidly upgrade my red blood cell count. The other thing that we look at in red blood cells or in blood values are the hemoglobin and hematocrit. So basically the H and H is what we call that, or HGB and HCT. Again, different values for different gender. And know that these are probably the most prevalent blood diagnostic values that you'll be looking at because hemoglobin is so important to the oxygen carrying capacity of the body, and so many disease processes are impacted by low oxygenation that we look at this as a baseline indicator for a lot of disease processes. One of the other RBC Lab values that we look at is the mean corpuscular volume. You don't have to memorize this. I'm not going to test you on it, but it's another one of the lab values that we use. Anemia is probably the most frequent red blood cell disease process that you're going to see. And basically it means that there's a lower number of red blood cells, meaning your oxygen carrying capability and capacity is diminished because of that lower number of red blood cells or hemoglobin in the body. This affects oxygen transportation by significantly impairing it. So that's why we look often when patients come into the hospital is we do a complete blood cell count or a CBC test to see do we have this process already present in our body, and we're starting out below normal, and we just need to know that. One of the signs and symptoms of general anemia is just an overall pallor or whiteness and extreme fatigue or shortness of breath on exertion. Becoming tired, feeling tired all the time. Again, very general symptomatology, but at least worth getting some blood work done to see if we have a decreased hemoglobin level. Some of the causes of anemia, one can be blood loss. So if you lose large amounts of volume of blood, you will have anemia. One is hemolysis. So if you have a pathological process in your body that is breaking red blood cells apart faster than the 120 days that they're supposed to stay in the body, you could have anemia. And last but not least, you have some sort of an impaired production in the making of red blood cells that leads to a decrease in hemoglobin. There are many different kinds of anemias in the body. The one that I'm mostly going to test you on is Iron-Deficiency Anemia. It's the one that you're most often going to see. It's most often caused by blood loss, but can be caused by a deficient nutrition source, nutritional deficiencies. Some of the other more severe but less common anemias that you might see would be aplastic anemia, where you have generalized bone marrow depression that affects all of your lines of blood cell production at the same time. There are different kinds of iron deficiency anemias. You do not have to memorize these, but you do need to know that there are basically three different kinds. One is due to irregular shape, one is due to irregular size, and one is due to having too little of the red blood cells. Vitamin B12 deficiency or pernicious anemia is a specific type of anemia caused by the fact that there is a vitamin B12 deficiency. It creates a different looking, like a megaloblastic, a bigger cell anemia with irregular shapes, and is very easy to see on a microscope. In the case of a vitamin B12 deficiency anemia, we would give vitamin B12 rather than the blood transfusion. Polycythemia is an abnormally high red blood cell count, basically a hematocrit that's over 50%. Again, one of the causes of this is just the loss of plasma volume or the fluid. And another cause is related to an increase of the total red blood cell mass in the body. Both are disease processes that happen to create polycythemia. Last but not least, we need to understand the age-related changes that happen with red blood cells on either end of the spectrum. I'm not going to talk about the middle because that's the normal and abnormals that we're talking about in this class. But newborns at birth have high hemoglobin levels, and their red blood cells live shorter lifespans, not the 120 days that you get as an adult, but more like half that amount. At birth, the destruction of red blood cells is significantly increased, and that creates a need for us to monitor the serum bilirubin in the newborns, because about 2 to 3 days after birth, the newborns, about 60 to 80% of newborns are subject to jaundice, and if we don't take care of the jaundice, it creates other problems. Jaundice is a yellowing color of the skin, the mucous membranes, and the sclera of the eyes, and that's how we know that it's going on, in addition to drawing the blood work. How we treat newborn jaundice is by an exchange transfusion, which is very, very rare. Most of the time we just put them under light or tell you to take them out in the sun so that they get the vitamin D in the sunlight to help break down that bilirubin in the body. Age-related changes in the red blood cells of the elderly most commonly show up as anemia. So know that as we age, there's a decrease in production of hemoglobin in the body and red blood cells, and that should we have large episodes of blood loss, we have a severely impacted or severely decreased ability to produce red blood cells and make up that hemopoietic reserve as we can when we're adults. So as an adult, if I have something that causes blood loss, say I go in and have a total hip replacement, which is a surgery that there's a lot of blood loss, as you can imagine. If I'm in my 30s or 40s and have a total hip replacement, my ability to replace the lost red blood cells through the volume takes me essentially 120 days, which is about 3 months, to try to get it back to the normal amounts. If I'm 70 it doesn't happen that fast. Instead of taking 3 months, it could potentially take up to 6 months, almost double the time. So you will see with elderly people, we tend to replace blood loss with blood transfusions more than we do for patients that are in the middle ages. And that's it for